Hello, I'm Dan+Erlewine and welcome to Advanced Fretting Vol.2. In this volume I've invited my friend Brian Gallup down from Big Rapids, Michigan to share in the teaching duties. Up in Big Rapids, Brian has a great repair shop, a great guitar building shop, and along with the Red Wing School and Roberto Venn, Brian's Gallup School of Luthery is one of the premier Luthery instruction schools in the land.
Hi, Dan.
Susan and I have worked hard to get the school to where we feel it's a really good micro guitar building shop. Every student gets their own bench, their own set of tools.
Hey John, will you check about royalties on that film for us? Right.
I have an elevated fretboard with a negative neck angle. This is not a classical peg head. And I thought a lot about it because even the steel string makers who make classical guitars, they make a classical looking peg head.
Did you get all the other stuff done? Mm-hmm. Your stuff turned off?
Yep, everything's all taken care of.
Yep. I'm sure things made things a lot faster.
Brian's developed his own methods of production fretting which he uses on his acoustic guitars, and he'd like to share them with you today. Here's Brian.
Thanks, Dan. And as always, it's a pleasure to be down here in Athens and visit my friend Dan and Joan and be a part of the videotapes. I think these are very important tapes. I have a few techniques on fretting that I'd like to share with you. A lot of these techniques I came up with in production, and you'll be surprised what you have to do when you're building guitars and trying to meet certain schedules. A lot of these techniques carried over into repairs, and I'd like to take the time to share them with you now. After fretting hundreds of Gallup guitars, I've developed more of a production fret job. Because I had things to deal with such as fresh lacquer on the edge of the fretboard, which would be likely to chip, and also I wanted to level the neck while it was on the body so I could get rid of any hump in the 14th fret. So if I can get into Dan's jig, I'll use this Gallup guitar as a demonstration. Now I'm in the neck jig, and this is a Stu Mack neck jig, which really isn't that much different than mine. Mine's a platform that goes all the way around the guitar, but basically the tool's the same. The guitar is strapped in with a couple of straps. That's just how I do it. The only difference from what I used to do maybe 10 years ago is the guitar doesn't have any strings on it at all. I know my neck so well that I can predict what they're going to do. As in time I was able to predict many guitars as I got to know the necks much better. My guitars are glued up with a little bit of relief in the neck, so the first thing I have to do is get the necks flat. I'm not going to use a light. What I do is I just come in, tighten it until I really get a rock, and you can see the straight edge spins right there. I can get a little rock in it. And I just loosen it until the rock stops. Just a little more and I got it. Just a smidgen more. And there it is. It's flat. Now I didn't spin the jig up on its side. I just don't feel I need to anymore. I know the necks very well. And I'm going to go ahead and level the fretboard out. Now the first thing, I'm going to set the dials to 0, even though I don't know if I really need that, but I always like to know what the neck's doing, and the one thing the dial calipers did do was teach me about necks. The next thing, before I level the fretboard, I got to bring the rods up. I watch the dial calipers to make sure I don't move the neck too much. I have a tolerance of 3 thousandths. If I can hold that, I'm pretty happy. Now I'm going to use this white Sanford marker, China marker, to go across the fretboard and put a series of pencil marks on there. I like to do an X pattern so that way I know that I got the entire fretboard covered. Next I'm going to protect the face of the guitar, and you have to remember to do this. I'm going to brush it off to make sure there's no debris. And I have these two scrapers that I've been using for years, and I've taken the edge and sanded them down and buffed them so there's no way they could damage the face of the guitar. And I lay them in place and mask them off. Now I pre-level my necks, which means that when the guitar is still in the white, I bolt the neck to it and level it into the jig. But then we go ahead and put the nut in and spray the guitar so I can get the lacquer on the side. I like that look. To protect the nut, to keep from hitting it when I'm leveling the fretboard, I pop a capo on there. Now I have this Stumac leveler, which is an O-beam, and it's ground on one side and it's very flat. I put 120 grit sandpaper on, which is this self-adhesive sandpaper. And I'm going to go ahead and level the board. Trying to keep it parallel with the neck. You wouldn't want to get it cockeyed with the neck. You'd mess the radius up. Now I'm going to continue to sand until the neck is flat. I know it's flat when all the white pencil marks are gone. I still have a few white pencil marks here. Got a little bit of a dip. Just continue to sand until the white pencil marks are gone. Now the white pencil marks are gone, so I know the neck is flat, but as you can see I still have a few pencil marks left up here in the nut area. I was bumping into my capo, and plus I don't really care what happens past the first fret to the nut, so this job's done. Now that the fretboard is leveled, I'm going to move out of the neck jig over onto a workbench to hammer the frets in. I'll move back into the neck jig later on to level the frets. Now I'm going to finish sand the neck up to a 320 finish. First it's 180, then 240 and 320, and I have a little rubber backer. Next I'm going to go through every slot to check its depth and width to make sure that it's clean of all debris, especially down in these corners. That's very important, or your fret ends won't go down. And then I'll take it and check the width. And this is a 24. That's just how it should go in. That's perfect. Now I use a fret bender to bend my frets. My fretboard's a 14, but I like my fret wire slightly overbent. The next step is to cut the fret into lengths. I like to cut them approximately 1/8 inch longer on both ends. Gives me plenty to work with. Now I put the frets in a fret block that's numbered for each individual fret so I can keep them straight. And I'm going to start nipping the tangs back so that I can clear the binding. That way I don't blast the tang down through the binding. Just check every individual one. The fret tang nippers always leave a little bit of the tang, and that'll put a dent in your binding and you'll be able to see it. So you have to come back with a file and just lightly take that off. Be sure to keep it level to the bead and not file a notch into the bottom of the bead. And then I put it right back into the fret block so I know which fret goes in which slot. It's very important. On the edge of the neck, there's a thin film of lacquer that's roughly about 5/1000 thick. And when the bottom of the bead hits that, it could chip it, so we have to knock that back. I have 320 sandpaper and ever so lightly knock it back. A little guard here. You don't want to create a huge bevel. I'm going to use this paste wax. I'm going to get a little bit on this paper towel, wipe off the excess. This is very important so we don't get any clunks down in the front slot. I'm going to move back and just wax it off ever so lightly. Put a thin film of wax on this. Now before I do any fret job, and a hammer and fret job that is, I have this 5x5 piece of steel wrapped in leather that I can just set down and set the neck on it so I can hammer on there. Also on the body, I'm going to use a Taylor fret buck so I can support the tongue area. It'll slide right in place. And crank it up. Remember not to over crank this, you could break the guitar. And no matter where I hammer on it, I'll have good support. Now I'm ready to install the fret. I'm going to take some number 30 thick super glue. I'm going to force it right down into the slot. Grab the fret wire and hammer it into place. I like to lightly overbend the ends, and that's it. Try to keep that neck over top that buck. It's really important. Very careful down here on the tongue with the super glue. All in all, this has taken about 2-3 minutes to get all these frets in. While the super glue is still a little wet, I'm going to remove the fret buck. Slide the guitar back and accelerate the glue. Remember to use an accelerator that doesn't react with the finish. Just blow it off. Any excessive glue, that'll just set up the top, and now I can come in and just peel it off. This is a dull chisel, by the way. I have it polished so that it won't dig into the fretboard. Just pops it off. And because we min-waxed the board, the glue will just peel up. Now I've replaced my guards to protect the face of the guitar, and I'm going to take this box cutter blade. I'm going to clean up the super glue in between the frets. Remember, don't gouge into the fretboard. It just takes a little bit to clean it up. Go back and forth between the frets, take the point, come in and just break that burr off on both sides, and go to the next one. Now use the edge of the blade to get down and break off that burr. Now once this is done, just let that fret job set for about a half hour. Okay, now I'm going to nip the fret ends. I like to keep it back just a little bit, and hear that tone? That tells you that they're tight. Nip them on a slight angle. Be sure and put guards on the face of the guitar. Now these are my edging files. I've had these for about 19 years. I think I made these when I was back at Dan's shop. Of course, they're just regular mill files ground down. But what I like about these is they're broke in. I'm going to edge the frets. I like to have them at about a 30-degree angle. Very carefully. Don't dig down into the lacquer. On my final stroke, I like to turn it around and cut on the upstroke. I feel I get better looking fret ends that way. As you can see, I replaced my K-post so I don't hit my nut. I'm going to round the fret ends, just to give a nice little round. Once I have it to where they're rounded over, I'm going to take my little rubber fretting block and polish this up with a little 320, which takes the file scratches out. And I finalize that with some 1000 grit. Polishes them up. I pay close attention to my fret ends. I think it's very important. going to round those fret ends with my 3-corner file that I also made. Then I'm going to come in with my little rubber block and some 320 sandpaper and sand those up just to get the file marks out. And I'll finalize that with some 1000 grit. Now the file that I'm using is a 3-corner file that, again, I made 18 years ago, and it's a safe file. I ground this off so it won't dig into the fretboard, and I like it because it's, like I said, it's nice and wore out. And this is a little rubber block that fits into those contour sanders, and I think it's great for grabbing sandpaper and doing the ends. Now I'm going to glue off the tops of the frets with this power mark. Remember, don't hit the fretboard, and if you're going to hit the fretboard, you think you might, you're going to have to mask it off ahead of time. Now I've got the guitar back in the jig, I probably am going to have to mess with the truss rod a little bit. I'm going to use this notch straight edge to put it back on the fretboard. I know the fretboard's flat, but the frets may have caused a little fret compression. I just tighten it until I get a rock, loosen it until that rock just a little more stops. Now I know the neck is back straight again. I set my dial calipers. This is just for reference. I like to know when I bring the rods up, I'm not moving the neck around. And I go ahead and bring the rods up. Be sure not to move your calipers any more than whatever tolerance you're allowing yourself. I like about 2-3 thousandths, and they're right on the money. And I'm ready to level. Now I've got the frets blued. I'm going to go ahead and level the top. I have that same bar, but I have a 320 Mylar backed paper. This stuff is really important. I just couldn't do it without this. And I'm going to put it on there and move back and forth carefully until it just hits the top of the frets. Now I've made about 4 passes with the leveler, and as you can see, the blue's being removed off the top of the frets almost immediately. That tells me not only that my fretboard playing surface is flat, my frets are down, and I have it back in just about the same position. If you're taking an excessive amount off, then you got a high fret or something's not right. It should take just a few passes. Now mask off the fretboard so you can protect that. Make sure the masking tape goes right up to the fret but covers the fretboard. Now these are my 2 rounding files. Again, my 3-corner safe file that I've made years ago. I have to use that every so often, but I'm really enjoying my diamond rounding file, which is my file of choice, but it's not uncommon for me to use both of them in the same dress. It's just a little rolling action. I'm using one side of the file and just flipping it over. Don't over file the fret. You want to make sure you leave a little bit of blue on the top so that way you haven't messed with your leveling job. Kind of catch those ends a little bit. Now when I get up to the tongue, it's really hard for me to use the rounding file. I start to run into the face of the guitar. So I switch to the diming file. And it gets right in there. I use the diamond file a lot actually anymore, especially when I don't have much rounding to do. Now as we were talking about it, Dan handed me this offset diamond rounding file, and I'm using it, and I actually like it a lot. I would prefer to use this. I think I'll order one.
You can have it.
Thanks, Dan. Now I like to come back with my 3-corner file and touch up the ends just a little bit, ever so lightly. Got to pay close attention to the fret ends. Okay, once I'm done with that, I can move right into the sandpaper. The first one I'm going to use is a 320. Just go right to the sides, try to stay away from the top at this point. Once I finish with the 320, I'm going to move to a little 3M Imperial 600. Same process. Just hit the sides, kind of stay away from the top. Now that I'm finished with the 600, I'm going to move to my last paper, which is a little 1000 grit, but this time I'm going to hit the tops. The 1000 grit is less likely to damage my leveling job, and I can polish those tops. I'm looking for any scratches on the tops that are left behind. There really shouldn't be too many. If you see any, and they're super deep, you can go back to the 600, but you should be able to just take care of it with the 1000 grit. Now that I've finished with the 600 and 1000, I go over it with a little 4/0 steel wool. In my shop, I go to the buffer every time to do the final buff, but this does a pretty good job. I go ahead and remove my masking tape. Now I go over this with a little more 1000 grit to make sure that they shine and they don't have any sharp edges. Feels good. Now the top of the binding always seems to get dirty. I like to take my scraper, come in and just clean that up. Don't go over top your frets and mess up your nice polish job. And also I like to just kiss that. I like to put a little bit of fretboard treatment on at the end. You could put many things on, lemon oil or linseed oil or Murphy's oil soap, but I think it cleans up the fretboard and gets some of the debris out of the way. Also, I like to take a look at the fret ends to make sure that they're nice and polished, and they are. This is a good fret job. This fret job it's nice and it's tight. There are no loose fret ends. That's very important. Again, this is just one fret job, a production fret job. That's what I call it, and it works for me. I like it.
As long as Brian's on a roll, I'm going to keep him working. Next, I've asked him to show you how to fret in the arbor press.
The arbor press, you have to pay attention to the mechanism, which pushes down on the frets. This has to pivot. It has to go back and forth, so that way we can get a good bearing down in the neck. That's really important. And you have to choose the correct radius call that goes with the neck. StewMac sells a lot of radius calls. I've made a lot of my own. And in a heartbeat, if my radius call didn't fit, I absolutely would make one out of aluminum right on the spot if I had to. But these are quite quick, and I use them all the time. The radius call that I chose for this neck was 7 1/4. The neck was supposed to be 7 1/4, but the 7 1/4 radius call that I chose was slightly over radius, and I like that. It puts a little extra pressure on the ends. The first thing you'll have to do is check your fret slot. These fret slots are fresh, but I never would fret anything without checking its depth and trying to establish what type of a fret slot it is, whether it's cut flat or it's cut with the radius of the fretboard. This fret slot is radius with the fretboard. You can see I slide this scale across here, and it's pretty much the same depth. And then I take the scale and I just check the depth really quick, and I can see that this one, not pushing it down too hard, registers about 70 thou. I'm going to use a set of dial calipers that have a notch cut in it. That's really important for fret work. This way I can come in and measure the overall height of the fret, and that measures 104, and then I can measure just the bead height, subtract the two, and it tells me what the tang depth would be. In this case it's going to be 60 thousandths, which is roughly 1/16 of an inch, and the depth of the slot 70 thousandths, which is 10 thousandths deeper. That's perfect. The next thing that I want to check is the tang width. I have a piece of wire in there, and it measures about 22 thousandths tang width, 22.5. That can vary. I'm going to call this 22. Now that I've established the depth of the tang, and I know that it's not going to bottom out, that's very important, and I know the width 22, I have to check the slot. Here's a 21 thousandths feeler gauge, and I slide it in. You can see it's loose, so it's definitely going to be wider than that. I'm going to jump up to, let's say, a 20. I'm going to grab this 24. Let's check that. Slide it in. See how that just slid in perfectly? That's it. It's definitely a 24. I've established that the slot's a 24 and the tang is a 22, which is actually perfect for this maple neck. You have to be careful about that. If you get too big of a tang in the slot, like let's say you hit it 1-to-1, which would be a 24 thousandths tang and a 24 thousandths slot, you could run the risk of backbowing the neck. We're going to have no problem with this. The 22 will fit in perfectly. Now I'm going to check the radius of the wire. I can notice that this wire right off the spool actually has a little bit of a rock in it. That's no good. You'll have loose fret ends. So I've set up this Waverly fret bender so that I can run that through and give it just a little more of a bend. Now when I go back, it'll actually be slightly overbent, which is what I prefer. You can see there's a little gap in the center right there. See that? I'm going to go ahead and just take this right off with the arbor press. It's much easier to do that, and nip my frets. I'm going to nip them about 1/8 of an inch longer on each side than the neck. It gives you enough fret wire to work with. Now I've chosen a caul that's slightly over radius. We talked about that. And also I have my fret wire slightly over radius. And you can see this. That's important. This fret wire has a 50,000 speed, and that's pretty firm. It's not going to lay in. I have a little bottle of tight bond glue or aliphatic resin, and I'm going to push that right down into the slot. This really helps. Wipe off the excess, especially on a refret where a slot's been chewed up. Maybe had 3 or 4 different jobs in it. Even if it's oversized, this really helps. Go ahead and lay that fret wire in there, put my finger on it, and just set the ends. That way it won't flop sideways when we press it in. And we come in and get a hold of that, and just, that's it. Now what I do is I lift it up. Sometimes I just set that center down, lays it in beautifully, come back, push it back down, hold it right there, grab a firm hammer, and I just lightly tap that fret sideways, which scooted the tangs over, and just set it in there. Let me do one more here. Force that glue right down into the slot. You can wipe it off with your finger, or you can use a little damp rag or paper towel. Grab the fret, tap it in place. Just want to seat those ends in. It's kind of important. That way it won't flop sideways. Press it in and hold it there for a second. Bring it back out. Press it, knock that center down. That wasn't a very hard hit. Just kind of sounded loud, and then tap the tang sideways, which seats the studs. It's a beautiful thing. Now I tested these frets, and also I wanted to demonstrate that, but this is how I'd fret this neck. I have everything taken care of. This is when you start making some money. Put glue in all of them. It's not going to harden up. And make sure you get it on those ends. Right there, I could get a little more on that one. Press them in. At this point, I like to think to myself, $20, $40, $60. Makes me feel better. Just press them in. It doesn't take a lot of pressure. Remember, when the bead's down against the neck, you are done. This is a 1-ton press, you know. You could do damage. Stress the neck a little bit, that's pretty common. Now the last step, of course, each fret, just give it that little tap there, which taps that sideways. Doesn't take much. I can see it move. Okay, I'm going to pop this down now, and as you can see, we have a little bit of glue. You want to clean that up right now. I have just a light damp rag. I'm going to go around and just clean that up. Now, I've finished cleaning up the frets, and I noticed on the edge of the board it had a little extra roll on the end, which can be very typical of fenders. If you want to, you can actually tap the end of the fret down and roll that just a little bit. Just you might lift it in the center. The arbor press is great for that, for holding it down while you give that a little light roll. Nothing too drastic. Now on the front of this arbor press, Dan's added this little lock, and I have that on mine. What that's for is in case you have one loose fret that's giving you a problem, you could walk in, press that down like that, put pressure on it, and lock it and walk away and give it time to dry. I've just put these frets in. Everything is fine. I've rolled the ends. I'm going to let this go for about, I would say, an hour. I'm in no big hurry. Just set it aside and go do something else and let them harden up. They've been drying for about an hour. Just going to nip the fret ends. I like to leave a little extra fret, not nip it too close. Now when you nip these fret ends, you hear that tone? That's what you want. You know the fret end's tight. If you hear a loose sound, you can tell. I'm going to file the fret ends to about a 30-degree angle. Be careful, don't hit the peg head. I'm going to round the edges with the 3/4 file very carefully, and then I'm going to sand it with 320 and then 1000 just to kind of take out the file marks. I'm checking the fret ends now. You have to pay close attention to that to make sure there's no burrs. At this point I have to make a decision where I'm going to be going with the dress. If it's a vintage neck and I just wanted to pop the frets in, I would be done. I have to pay close attention to the fret ends. If I'm going to be lacquering it, the lacquer will kind of cover up a portion of the bottom of the fret ends and not make them so they feel so rough. But you have to kind of make a decision at this point. I'm going to leave this for Dan and let him decide what he wants to do. This looks really good. I like the fret wire that he chose. It's a Stumac 155. That's 50 thousandths tall. That's a great wire on a maple neck if you're going to be lacquering, because you're going to be losing about 5 thou in lacquer thickness. But this is great. This is finished. It looks good.
Thanks, Brian. I've been wanting to have this fretted for 6 years now. I'm thinking about only putting a light coat of shellac on this. I want to play a real dry feeling neck. Now if I can get someone to make a nut for it and put tuners on it, I'll be that much closer to playing it. Geez, if we keep Brian around here much longer, he'll fret everything into place. Sometime in the late 60s, I had a customer that gave me some third-hand information. He said that when Fender fretted their guitars, they slid the frets in sideways, and I scoffed at that. I said, there's no way. It's impossible. You can't do that. And I ignored that choice bit of information for about 22 years, and I wish I hadn't. In the late 80s, around 89 or 1990, I met Wayne Charvel at the NAMM show in Los Angeles, and he verified it. He said, oh yeah, they did that. I worked there and I saw them do it. There'd be little piles of sawdust on the outside of the neck as they slid the frets in. Well, of course, as soon as I got home and got my hands on a vintage guitar, I took a little awl and I tried to tap one out and it came right out. Tapped out another one and went all the way down the neck and had these nice clean slots. If you don't tap them out, when you pull them out from above, as we're going to demonstrate here, you'll get a lot of little chips because the fret went in sideways. After I experimented with this method for a year or so, I was at the Asia convention in Amherst, Massachusetts, where Brian Gallup and I gave a joint demonstration on fretting, and we hitched a ride to the Hartford airport in the back of James Ricard's truck. Jim has since passed away, and God bless his soul. Jim said, oh yeah, I saw that done. In fact, I went home and made the tool, and he sent me a photograph of it, and this is a drawing of that. There would be a big stack of sharpened frets sitting on the table, and the operator had a foot-operated lever that came up on pulleys connected to this handheld mechanism that would hold the fret and drive it across the board. and the whole neck would be fretted in less than 2 minutes, depending on how the operator felt that day. Also, depending on how the operator felt that day would determine on how deep the fret went into the wood. If the operator was heavy-handed or tired, he could press that fret too hard into the wood and it could easily be buried into the wood at least 5/1000ths of an inch and then be shorter than its neighbors. Add a layer of lacquer or later on polyester in the 70s and you lost a lot of fret height before you even started. Fender fretted this way until 1982. Here's a 1973 Telecaster neck that had a very badly broken peg head. We opted to replace the neck with an original Fender neck, and the customer was nice enough to let me keep this, and I've saved it just for this tape. Now Brian Gallup's hanging around the shop wishing he had something to do, so I'm going to bring him in here to show you how to remove frets the proper way and replace them on a vintage Fender neck.
The Fender sideways fret job can be a pretty easy fret job. There's a couple things that you should know about. First, I do think that most of the frets were stuck in from one side, but sometimes it seems like the guy may have flipped the neck halfway through. As you drive it out, everything will be going fine, and then for some reason you have to start driving them out from the other side. I've also had that happen to just one fret, so it could be the run out of the wood. Also, on some of the rosewood fretboards, they seem to be chippy, and you're just going to have to kind of keep an eye on that. Cold is how I'm going to drive them out with no heat. That's what I'm going to try first. I have my best results doing that, and I'm not against using a soldering gun. I use a soldering gun most of the time. This is a Weller. I like to take a tip and file a little groove in the end of it so it can ride on the fret. I'll take a little round file and create a small groove in it, just deep enough to capture the fret, and then just roll the ends. Whatever you do, you want to make sure that these ends aren't so deep that they'll go down and gouge into the maple neck or the rosewood. I like to drive the frets out toward me. I feel I have my best control. What I'm going to do is to take a punch. I'm going to use a nail set is what I like best. Dan says he likes to use some of these other small punches with more of a point, but the end of the nail set kind of digs into the fret, creating a little bit of an area to grab it and pop it out. And this is what it should look like. You see the fret just, and I'm doing this cold right now. I haven't put any heat on it. I'll do that if I have to. Whoop. Sometimes it takes a little bit to get a hold of it. There it goes. And it pops right out. You can see the slots nice and clean. One last little tap and out it comes. You can also take these frets, which are really quite fresh, and you can save these. Sometimes when you have to do a partial refret on an older Fender neck, you can just pop these up to the other end of the neck, where generally the first 5 might only be wore out. I wanted to pull one of these frets out with just a set of nippers. I'm not really being too careful because it is a scrap neck, but see those chips? No matter if you heat them, they're going to come up. The frets were put in sideways, and now you're trying to pull it straight out where the stud never left a trail to come out of in the first place. On a rosewood board, this will be even worse. Look at that. There you go. That's what it'll look like. If I would have heated that, it wouldn't have been that bad. And I could stop and start super gluing this in, but why would you want to? Once you learn how to drive them out sideways, that's the correct technique. And there's the chipping I'm talking about. That's a major chipping. This, at the least, this is the minimum chipping you'll get. And even then, sometimes when you put the frets in, you can see that underneath the frets. So, you know, what do you want? This or this beautiful clean slot right here? That's the way it should look. Now, as I drive the frets out, every once in a while you are going to get a little blowout. You can see it right there in the very end. You could stop and just kind of push that back in place and drop a little red stuff super glue so the chip doesn't fall out. See the chip, it's right there. I've pushed it back into place. I'm going to take a little bit of super glue, some thin super glue, just put it right on here. It'll run right underneath it and super glue it right into place. Take care of the excess, push it down. Take this little Teflon burnisher or something that won't stick to the super glue and just kind of burnish it down in place. Pull it back. That looks pretty good. I'm checking the depth of the tang, and as you can see, it's measuring about 70 thou, which is typical for just about everything. I've seen them a little shallower sometimes, but that's pretty typical. The fender wire that originally came out, although measures approximately 50 thousandths, I've seen it as deep as 55. If you stick a standard wire in there where the new tang depth is closer to 60 or sometimes a little over, it'll push down to the end of the slots and tend to look a little awkward. So you have to make a decision what do you want to do, if you want to have a vintage look or just force it down in there. Also, when I was checking the width of the slot on this one, even though I think it started out closer to 21 after years of being there and the fret coming out, this feels a little closer to a 23. As you can see, that's a 23 thousandths feeler gauge, and it'll go in there. Maybe a 22. Let me get another one out. Here's a 22. They can actually vary. Yeah, 22 goes in there. I'm going to call this a 22. Here's a 1965 Fender Jazz bass that has a veneer board. They made them both ways with the veneer and a slab board. Slabs are much thicker. These things are sometimes around 100 thousandths in thickness, and as you can see, there's not a lot of room between the bottom of the fret and the back of the fretboard. Many times I've seen guys deepen the slots with a saw, and that actual tang is right down into the maple. You absolutely cannot do that. You're going to have to take the actual tang on the fret wire that you're using and shallow it by filing a little off the back. On a maple neck, it's quite not so crucial because you can't really see it, but I just do it to off-fender fret wire. Let me demonstrate that. As I mic out this wire, it's reading roughly 80 thousandths in width, which is typical. The height is registering closer to 29. I think it started out like around 35. I'm going to use a Martin guitar fret wire. I'm choosing that because the bead is identical, a little bit taller, which I like, but the most important thing is they have a variety of tang sizes, so I can match that 22 thousandths slot that we measured out. The wire is a little bit tall on the tang. If I press that in, it would go down too far into the neck. We don't want that. We've already discussed it. So I'm going to take a file and just knock a little bit off the top down to just under 50 thou, which is what I like. I'll just do this to every piece. Now there's what we were talking about, where the guy fell asleep or just pushed too hard, but he actually crammed that fret right down in to the fretboard. I see it more on maple necks than I do on rosewoods. I think the rosewood's a little more resilient, but that, if you could measure that gap right there, that gouge would be 3 thousandths. But the fret will lay back down in there. It'll look good. Now, on these maple necks, there's going to be a little ridge of lacquer. You can actually hear it. It sticks up there 2-3 thou. I'm going to take a mill file. I'll do this to the entire neck, and I'll just knock that off. You can do this without disturbing the lacquer in the center. Here it goes. You can feel it. And pay attention to those ends. Now let's I've already tested one fret. It went well. I have it in the arbor press. I've chosen a call that's slightly over. You could use the same radius. I like it slightly over. I'm going to put a little white glue in the slot. You could use shellac or high glue. I'll wipe that off. I have my fret bent slightly over. Seat the ends in. That's so it doesn't flop sideways on you. And press it down in place. That felt perfect. Remember, you still could come in and give it a light tap sideways. I've stuck 3 frets in just to give you an example of what it's going to look like. The fret ends look excellent. The tangs aren't too deep. To many people, this will appear as a vintage. It does look good, but 3 frets is enough. Dan called this a scrap neck, but I think he could finish it out and make a real player out of it. This is far enough to go on this. Let's get on to something else. Maybe we get Dan up here.
Thanks again, Brian. You've gotten me out of trouble on a couple of telly necks now. If I can find someone to finish this up and fix that peg head, I'll have 2 of them going. I thought it was important to talk about the fender sideways fretting on this tape, and I think Brian covered it right there. We don't need to go down this whole neck. We just did that a little while ago on the other telly neck.
Dan told me somewhere on these tapes that he had taken the crown inlays out of a 50s Les Paul. We started talking about pearl inlays, so I thought I'd take this time to show you a few tips on removing pearl inlays. I thought I'd use Dan's Plexig demo guitar to demonstrate this. These are the pearl inlays I'm going to remove. The reason you might want to remove a pearl inlay, just recently I did a fret job on a master tone banjo and it said master tone across a big block. And so I removed that ahead of time, or I would have certainly gone through the letters. Other times you can see that the pearl inlays are thin on the outside. They're almost translucent, and you want to pull those out before you remove a hump at the 14th fret. Just preventative pearl inlay removal. When I heat the pearl up, I'm going to place this little piece of brass shim stock on the pearl and then put my soldering iron on there. This is pretty hot, and that'll loosen up the glue. Getting the pearl out, sometimes there's no good way other than getting an X-Acto knife, and I like a micro chisel. You just work around the edge and try not to break it. Pry it out. I'm going to remove this pearl at the 12th fret. Put your shim stock on there. Take your soldering iron and just start moving it around. That brass will disperse the heat. This is a brand new neck ebony fretboard. My guess is this is going to come out pretty hard. It's been about 2 or 3 minutes. You just got to kind of check it. I'm going to pop it off and give it a shot. Take some hemos and just take that hot brass off of there. It's got a little burn to it. That'll sand off. I'm going to come in and just start getting a spot to dig in. You're definitely going to be disturbing the wood, but you can fix that. This is coming out hard. This is harder than normal, especially on like an older guitar. It'll pop out easily. This is like delaminating or something. It's flaking off. I think that this might even be a man-made laminated pearl. It's not a big deal. I can just take this pearl out and make a new one. If it's a plastic inlay, you really have to save it because it has a patina, but I can make a new one of those. As I said, this is a brand new neck, and you can see that this demo neck, it never even was finished. Dan it was a loaner. And the pocket was cut perfectly. It's probably on a CNC. The tolerances are very close. Even though I've dug all the way around, it still doesn't want to break loose. I'm going to heat it up a little bit more. I've heated it for about another 2 minutes, and then I came and made a bold cut in the side so I get that X-Acto down in there. You can see just prying it right out now. Now that one came out pretty tough. On an older neck, I think when the wood expands and contracts, there seems to be more gaps and it comes out a lot easier. This brand new neck, and the pearl may be laminated, I don't know. But as tough as that came out, we could try a different approach. I'm not against taking a little bit of water on a rag and getting a little steam on that. I'll swell that wood a little bit. I'm going to be leveling the fretboard anyways. Get some heat on that pearl to loosen up that epoxy or cyanoacrylate or whatever it is. Who knows? I'm going to make a deep cut this time on this side so I can get underneath it without flaking it or chipping it. Just ebony, I can repair that easily. It's coming out. Don't be in any big hurry. Lightly pry it. It's coming out. Here's both inlays. This one came out cleanly. Here's the one that flaked out on me. I'll definitely have to make a new one here. I can't just flip it. The pattern's not correct. If it was a block square, I could do that. Use the other side possibly. Both holes are clean though. That's a big deal. If you were going to fret this guitar, you could just remove the frets and flatten the fretboard. The pockets wouldn't be shallow enough, so you'd have to get a moto tool and deepen that. The thickness of these pearls are about 60 thousandths. You'd have to deepen the pocket, and then you could just glue that right back in place. Well, that's one more thing to think about when you're fretting guitars. Removing pearl inlays is not a job that I'm in love with, and I always like, oh, when I have to do it, because it can be tough. But on an older instrument like a vintage instrument, that's important. It's just something that you have to think about.
Thanks, Brian. That's good advice. I agree with you. When I know I have to take pearls out, it's like, oh, it's a big job when you know you have to make them. Another point to consider is that as repairmen, we're often refretting guitars that have been refretted since the 1950s or 40s. It might be the second or third time around. And I think that in the old days, they didn't pay as much attention to what they were doing as we do. I really believe that. And they would just sand away and sand that pearl, so by the time you get it, it's very thin, and you go into the job knowing that you'll have to replace pearls, so you'll need to get good at it. Last year in this shop, we did a 1930s Epiphone with cloud inlays and had to replace most of them. They were paper thin. We laid them on a flat block of wood and spaced them out just like they would be on the neck. Superglued the pearl down and went to the belt sander and radiused it to the 7 or 9 inch radius. It was a very tight board. We pre-radiused them so that we wouldn't have to do all that horrible filing once they were inlaid. That's another tip for you. That's a great fret job, Brian. It really is.
It came out good.
I think all the guys in the shop that have been hanging around here have learned a lot, and we're probably going to change our techniques and get a lot quicker. Get out that hammer and the super glue. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me down.
You're welcome. Here's what I call a professional fret dress. By that I simply mean that I always do it in the neck jig, and I take the utmost care. This is a 57 gold top historic reissue. It's very light and toneful. It's had an antique job by Tom Murphy, and it's beautiful. It simply needs a good setup and a fret dressing. This particular one needs a new nut too. It was too low. That happens sometimes. I've already taken the nut out, and I replaced the nut on the nut tape. We don't do it here. I have a dummy nut in here so I can string it to pitch with the strings of the customer's choice. And the first thing I'll do, as I always do, is mark the truss rod, remove it, that is, loosen it first, don't tighten it, lubricate it, and put it back on. Then we'll tilt into the plane position and see how the neck adjusts. I've got the truss rod lubed and I'm tilting over in the plane position. That's not quite 90 degrees. It's about 86 degrees on the scale of my swivel vise here. Lock it in place. I've got the fluorescent backlight there, my notch straight edge for a 24 3/4 inch scale, and I'm taking a look at it, and I see a huge amount of relief. The first thing I'll do is just pull back on the peg head and see if the neck looks like it'll come straight when it is adjusted. And it's decent. When I say a good neck, I mean one that will adjust relatively straight. This will not be perfectly flat, I can see that already. We'll make it flat in the frets. Like most necks, the way I look at it, this neck needs help adjusting. I have the truss rod totally loose, a lot of back bow, string tension. I'm going to use this pull down strap to pull the neck into a back bow. Normally the strap goes behind the nut. It's my nut pull down, and I have a jack that pushes up the peg head to recreate the string tension. But here I'm doing something different. I'm bringing one rod up loose, touching the back of the neck, using my hand to pull the neck into a nice heavy back bow. When I see that with my rod, it's rocking, I can let up, and now I have a gap here. I'm going to tighten the rod, and I'm going to pull down on the peg head with my strap until the neck touches the rod and the gap is gone. This is where I'm going to tighten the nut. I won't be paying any attention to the mark that I made earlier, but I can look at it later if I want to. I'm just going snug. Now I hope that when I loosen the tension on the strap and I check it again, that I'll be in a back bow. Then I can loosen the rod to get it straight. or as straight as it'll go. I may refer to the mark that I scratched on that truss rod nut later. I always do that because I want to know where it was when it came in. There wasn't much tension on it when I loosened it, and I may refer to it later. Now I have a rock. I've got a hump right here in the center. I'm in a back bow, the strap's loose. That's just what I wanted. Now I'm going to loosen the truss rod until the rock stops, and that'll be as straight as I can get it. Be very light with your straight edge. I'm sorry to have this light turned on. I know it's kind of hard for the camera, but I can't see without it. Here's how much I'm going to turn the rod. I'll tell you when I get it straight. There's a big gap here. I want to see that go away. There's 1/8 of a turn right there. Now the straight edge is touching here, it's touching here, it's touching here, and nowhere else. I think that's as straight as this neck's going to get. It has fall away too. It's touching in 3 places. That's actually good. Again, very lightly, I'm resting a straight edge on the frets, and that reads better than the board does. The straight edge is touching most of the frets, not all of them. That means that this neck has been leveled and that the fretboard is imperfect. It's not perfectly flat. In a perfect world, we'd pull these frets out and level the board and get it dead flat. But these are tall frets. We'll measure them in a minute, and there's plenty to level out here. This is where I'm going to set my dials to 0. I'm taking another reading because I had the truss rod wrench in there. I don't even want the weight of that to affect this delicate measurement. It changed it by about 1/1000th. Now I'm jigged. The strings are off and the parts are put aside. I'm back over in the playing position. That's where I zero the dials again by pushing up on the peg head with the jack and pulling down on this cloth strap in the nut area. What we're doing is creating this effect. The strings pull up on the peg head and they bear down at the nut. I'll flex the strap on purpose to get rid of a little of the slack. That'll change the readings. And I just keep adjusting the 2 adjustments here till both dials are zeroed, and they're zeroed right there. I've already looked at it with a notch straight edge and it's showing me exactly what I saw before. It's important to remember what you saw. And the straight edge is sitting on most of the frets just like they were before. That's where I bring up the support rods very gently, and I'm ready to level. I'm back level in the working position now. The fretboard is a 12. Sometimes they come through at a 10 out of Nashville. This is a 12, which is what it's supposed to be. I measured the fret height with my fret calipers, and they're 53 to 55 thousandths tall. I'm taped off. I don't even have to drop the pickup because these frets are plenty tall. I won't get near the mounting ring even. I'm going to start out using my steel diamond-plated leveler. StuMac sold these for a while. Had supplier troubles and we're always looking for them. Right now we don't have it, but you can use the steel bars that we sell that are surface ground and use the gold mylar paper. I'll kiss these frets down in no time at all, and I'll turn the light on and watch my progress. This is a red Marks-A-Lot pen. I'm being very careful of the binding and the crown inlays. The red gives me a color to look at, and I can see where I'm hitting and where I'm not with the leveler. I'm taking a firm stance on the ground, bending at the knees. It's my arms and shoulders that are doing the work. I'm going to go straight in line with the center of the neck. No tapering here. The strings taper out, but you don't do that with your leveler. Only if you were doing a compound fretboard would you do that. Follow the lie of the strings, which is angular, gets on center, and then gets back on a taper again. What will happen is I'll probably take most of the meat off here. I don't think it's going to hit here real quickly. There's fall away there, but I'll just have to see. And when I get down at the end, I stop. I don't really like to go back and forth as much as take a nice smooth stroke and stop. I notice if I go back and forth that there's a jiggly motion up here. I think it exaggerates that first fret. I'm holding a light overhead and passing it along the fretboard, you can see the light and dark spots. That's high and low frets. Shows you where you need to work. We want everything to be a shiny metal color. I'll go back and forth when I'm up on the solid part of the neck, but as I go towards the nut, I'm going to pick it up. I'm almost there. You can tell by the metal shavings where the frets were tallest. Just like I thought in the center, there's not much happening up on the extension there. We're going to take care of that separately. There's a couple little specks of red right in here. There's one over there. Sandpaper will get that. You have to know when to quit. I'm done with the diamonds right now. I'm leveling the extension by itself as a separate entity because it's fall away. I'm using 320 gold on the steel leveler. It just takes a little bit. It's that good a fret job here. I'll go sideways with it too. I like to finish up lengthwise so I can see the marks. When you go sideways, you eliminate the lengthwise stroke marks and it's hard to see when you're dressing. I'm using the long steel leveler on the main board with 320 grit. Getting rid of those diamond marks. I'll go sideways there too. I put red marker back on it one last time, and now I'm using a 12-inch radius block and 320. I'm just kissing the tops to get rid of any flat spots that might have been created by the lengthwise leveling. Re-establishing my radius. When I'm done with my leveling, which I am, I'm very careful and finicky about cleaning up this metal dust. I don't like to blow it or vacuum it because it can be really rough on your vacuum. I start with the back of the Mylar Stickum sandpaper. That picks up most of it. And I go right down the board. Any residue that's left over, I'll brush onto a little piece of cardboard and put in the trash. I don't want it on the floor. I vacuum the floor right away. In my shoes, getting up into the house, I don't want to breathe it. It's metal dust. I'll brush it onto the back of that sandpaper because it'll stick and catch. It'll take me a minute or two to clean this stuff up, but it's worth it. You want to be careful about the red permanent marker to get rid of that. Don't just go on it with a solvent like naphtha because it can bleed onto the pearls. I learned this trick from Adam J. Fox, who works here in the shop, and he's my co-producer of these videos and the cameraman. You take a dry erase marker, I'm using black, and color the red with that, and then wipe it up. And it just erases it. You can't just do it with paper. If you go on that red with paper, it stays there. It's a little trick that Adam taught me. This is a great trick because you can't use this dry erase marker on the top of the frets for dressing. It just doesn't hold up. This is another reason why I call this a deluxe job, because we go to every effort to be perfect. This came out great. It's dead flat. There's fall away starting about the 15th or 16th fret, just the right amount. I'd guess it to be about 5/1000ths of an inch. It's very important when you read a neck that you don't skew the straight edge. It's got to be in line with center or you won't get an accurate reading. These frets are ready to dress, and I'm going to have one of the guys do that. Now I'm going to jig a flat top acoustic. It's a Guild 12 string. Before I jig it, I check and make sure that the fingerboard's not loose, that it's not loose in this area, as often happens. I'd look to see if the peg head was ever broken. And I'm using these thin slats of wood with leather on them as a protective slat to spread the load. You can jig right on these swivel feet, but I prefer not to. I set it gently into the jig so the orange rods will hold the neck up, and I'll put a sandbag down on the body as a ballast to hold it while I level the body to the board and line up the neck to the support rods. I put one of the web clamps across the waist, snug it up, close the ratchet, and just snug it very little bit. I don't want to make a mark on the back of the neck by pulling the guitar down against the rods. If you have the neck jig, you already know how to use these tools, and if you don't, you'll probably be buying one, and that comes with an instructional tape. I put a second web clamp across the lower bout, and as soon as the body starts resting on the slats, I stop and lower these rods. I use a scrap of paper underneath the web to protect an old finish. If it's a newer finish, I'll put a little piece of rubber on top of that. I'm tuned up to pitch. I'm about ready to tilt it over in the jigging position, but first I'm going to make these marks on the truss rod nut so I know where the neck is now. Normally I would remove the nuts and lubricate the threads and the nuts, but they happen to be exactly where I want them and I don't want to mess with them. I might loosen them later when I'm done, but not now. I'm not even tilted in the plane position yet. I'm showing you the gap that runs from the 1st fret to the 4th or 5th. The edge touches, that's the hump. Then the gap starts coming back in again as you go up the neck. There's more light up here. Gets bigger, and then the straight edge comes back in and touches when it gets up on the body here, and it has fall away. I measured the gap on each side of that hump, and it's about 5 thousandths. So if I pull out the 3rd, 4th, and 5th fret along with the first 3, maybe even the 6th, this will be a flat neck. I don't have to refret the whole thing. When I'm tilted over in the playing position, I'm seeing almost the same thing, slight difference. If I push up on the neck, I'm pretending that I'm loosening the truss rods. I can move this hump around a little bit. I think I will loosen the truss rods, both of them, slightly to move this hump forward, and I'll have less wood to take off. There's that drop off at the 1st fret. You come down the neck, about the 5th, 6th, and 7th, you get a hump. On some necks, you could loosen the truss rod and the neck would come perfectly straight. I can imitate that by pushing on the peg head, but it doesn't come perfectly straight. Right there, it moves the hump towards the 3rd fret. I'm going to loosen these rods and move the hump towards the 3rd fret, and I'll take off less wood. To loosen these rods, I've got to move the G strings and the D strings out of the way, which is kind of a pain because they can break. I'm going to turn each one equally, like about 1/8 of a turn, no more. They're very tight. Each equally because this neck has the same amount of hump on both sides. I'll check that. That moved the hump up into this area, pretty close to the 1st fret. And now I have a little bit more gap here, but when I remove these frets in this section, the straight edge will fall right down. I'm going to repeat this process in the tilted position, zero the dials, and bring it back up to work on. I've got that same picture over in the playing position. I'm going to zero my dials and get those strings off there, all 12 of them. I've got the strings off. I'm going to tilt it back over into the playing position to re-zero the dials that I set earlier. This will reproduce string tension with the truss rods tight. I'm going to push up here on the jack and probably pull down at the nut. I push up on the peg head jack and that'll zero the dial. It's got a long ways to go because there's a lot of tension on this neck from 2 truss rods. I'm tilted over in the playing position. I used to re-zero the dials in the horizontal position, and a friend of mine suggested that this might be a better idea. Now I pull down on the strap here behind the nut and tighten it down here to zero the other dial. In this case, I didn't get the hump to come out exactly where I wanted it when I zeroed the dials. It was close. So I actually forced the neck by pulling down and pushing up to go where I wanted it to, which is a little bit off the 0 point, 3 thousandths off on the rear dial and 4 thousandths off on the front one. That doesn't matter because I'm very close in the necks right where I want it under tension. I'll re-zero these dials as a reference point. I've got a chisel tip on the soldering iron with a groove that I filed into it. A little bit of fresh solder doesn't hurt, it gets the frets hot quick. I put my puller around the fret. That protects the fretboard from this soldering iron, and get the groove right on that fret. Slide her back and forth and nip it out. I started roughing out a nut for this guitar and quit because I knew I was going to do some fret work and I didn't want to come to my final height till I did this. I'm going to save these old frets in case I want them for a measurement later. I measure the height of the existing wire at about 37 thousandths. Some are 38. These specially ground calipers sit right down over the fret and take the measurement with that little plunger that these digital calipers have. I'm going to get the nut out. It's a snug fit to get it out of my way. Got a little super glue on my nail there. These two feeler gauges stacked together read 38 thousandths. That's the height of the fret. It fits there, but it gets very tight as I come down and raises a straight edge. So with the straight edge sitting on the main body of frets, I want to level the board until it's a clean fit here. Before I do that, I want to level out these couple of high frets that were up on the body so the straight edge can really sit on all the frets. This is drafting tape. This wider tape is sign painter's tape to keep any crud out of the sound hole. And this is just a little scrap tortoiseshell pickguard material as a guard in case I slip with the file. It's these frets right in here that I'm really after. My file's not touching the rest of them very much. That's a smooth cut file. Really all I need is that little file. And I can smooth those up with this diamond sharpening stone. In fact, I'll just run that diamond stone right out onto the main frets just to kiss their tops and level everything and give the straight edge a nice flat surface to read from. You can see the frets that really were way too high, and the rest of them just needed a slight kissing. These took a little bit more off. These are just touched by the diamonds. After that little pre-leveling before we do our fret work, I'm at 36.5 now, which is just about the height of a Martin fret wire, which is probably what I'll replace this with. This is a 10-inch radius board. I want to know that. And the first thing I'm going to do is some scraping to get this nut end down in a hurry. It's way too high. I'll even go sideways down at the end to get some of that big hurry. That's the place I want to get. I'm following that scraper with some 80 grit. This is the gold mylar back, really tough stuff that's great for fretboards, and the finer grits, it's good on frets. I've got my stacked feeler gauges, 36 thousandths there, nice and smooth. I'm coming across the board, that's good. A little snug there, and definitely snug on the base side where you see this white. Right down in there, I'd say. I'm going to switch to a 120 grit now because this is about all ready, and lean on this a little more heavily. On second thought, before I get rid of the 80 grit, I'm going to wrap the main body of this sanding tube with a piece of paper to protect the fretboard. That'll also jack up that sandpaper so it concentrates on that front base corner. Then I'll switch to the 180. Now I've got 120 grit. I'm starting almost at the fret and pushing away from it. Kind of feathering that in. Getting rid of the 80 grit scratches, and I'm going to switch right to 220 because I'm about there. I'm going to raise the grain up with naphtha instead of water. It'll do the job and flash off real fast and not be soaking that wood with water. I don't want that. 220. Getting right up close to that fret and feathering those marks in. Just kiss any flats in with a 10-inch radius block. Sanding more here than there. I'm not kidding about this. You might check the body position here because I'm really holding myself planted on the floor, straight in line with the neck. Shoulders are stiff. The arms are holding this thing strong. I'm ready to put 6 frets in this thing. I'm going to use Martin fret wire because it's just about the right height. It's about 37 or 36.5. And this particular gauge is going to be an easy press fit. I won't have to fight it going in. I took a test scrap of wire and bent it into an L shape and filed the barbs off the tang so that it slides right in. There's a little depth gauge to see if the slots are deep enough. I need to clean these out a bit. I took a variety of these old Blitz saw blades and cut them into small pieces. There's a little Japanese saw blade, that's what I'm using this time. And I fasten them into my Blitz saw handle so that my saw stays down in the slot rather than a big saw blade that might cut up and out of the slot where I don't want it to. I set the blade down into the slot, draw it backwards first and clean out the glue, and it deepens the slot at the same time. Before I start sawing too much, I'm going to bevel the edges of each slot with this little diamond shaped file. You could use a triangle file. It knocks off that edge so the fret will go in easier, and it also lets the saw blade get down in there without chipping. I'd also go through there with a little slot cleaning knife and pull out any excess glue and sawdust. It's a combination of that and the saw blade. Now my test piece fits all the way across in all the slots. I clean the wire 2 or 3 times with naphtha on a paper towel. A lot of that black grease comes off. You don't want that, especially if you're going to use glue. Run the wire through the fret bender to the exact curve of the fretboard. Cut each piece to length with about a 3/16 overhang. I cut each tang to length slightly shorter than the edge of the fretboard using the tang notcher, but I leave the overhang. I've already put 2 frets in. I'm using the fret press. Drop the stud, come in with the press with a 10-inch caul, press them down, and I'm using medium viscosity super glue. I'm about ready to put the 3rd fret in. When a fret's really a tight fit in there, I might not do this, but it doesn't hurt to come in with a radius block. It's a 10-inch block, and clamp that fret level with the 2 that are next to it so the tops will be perfectly aligned. Let it set for a second. I'll wipe that with a little swab with the accelerator and take the clamp off. There's the old fret. The new frets are a tiny bit taller. They just pick up that straight edge a little bit, but it sits perfectly flush on all 3 of these new frets. Okay, the frets are all in. I'm leveling the tops down a bit so they'll come to the height of the original frets. I'm going to start my leveling out with a 6-inch leveling file, smooth cut. I'm following that file with a diamond leveler. This is where the fret overhang helps out when you're leveling. As you get to the edge, it helps support whatever tool that you're using so you don't overroll the edges. This is a longer diamond leveler. It's 16 inches. Another one that we sold years ago. This actually belonged to the Collins Guitar Factory, and they sent it back because they thought the diamonds wore off too fast. For me, they just broken it in, and I've been using it for the 7 years since. It's my favorite. It's the most gentle. I'm just smoothing all the frets in with the new ones now. I'm coloring all the tops of the frets with a red permanent magic marker, and that lets me see what the diamonds are hitting all the way down the board. I'm following the diamonds with this steel fret leveler. It's a tube that's surface ground flat on both of the thin sides. This is 320 grit free cut gold. If you don't have a diamond leveler, you can level the frets with this bar using that gold free cut paper. You might want to start with 220 and then go to 320. I follow that with my radius block. That'll connect any little flats that I might have created when going lengthwise. And I can see it when I look at the paper. When I see the block sort of loading up on the edges but not in the center like that, I'll switch to a 12-inch block, even though I know this fingerboard's basically a 10, and work the center down with that and see what it picks up. That's getting the center. So I've sort of got a combination of a 10 and a 12. I might stay on the 12-inch now and then rock it, slightly roll it to pick up the edges. I'm combining a 10 into a 12. And at that point I'll quit, nip the fret ends, bevel them, and dress them. When I nip very close to the lacquer, but I leave a little bit of light, because the nipper will tend to want to pull itself in towards the fretboard. See the light? I'm not going to bevel at a 45, more like a 60, but I like to see that light. When it starts to go away, I'll switch to a smoother file. I'm using that coarse grit fingerboard leveler to get the rough ends, and then I'll switch to a smoother one. I'll go backwards with it too. I'm going backwards because if I go forwards, I'm going to hit the nut up here. If you go up in there, you're going to hit the edge of the peg head. These are about ready for the smooth file. This is the smooth file now. I don't have any tangs to get because I've already cut them with the tang nipper. I'm just getting the bevel, and I want to match the bevel that's on the fretboard, the older frets. There's a 45 and there's about a 60. I'll have to go somewhere in between to match the original frets. They're a little steeper than I probably would have left them. Well, that's enough on the Gill 12 string. I'm going to bevel it and dress it just like we have others. I really wanted to show you the hump in this neck, how I do a partial refret, and how to jig a flat top in the neck jig. Now we'll get on to something else. Now we go back in time to 1993 in Amherst, Massachusetts at the Asia Symposium. You'll see T.J. Thompson bar fret a 1931 OM45, followed by Michael Stevens showing his tools and techniques for fender fretting. Then we jump up to 1996 at the Great Northwood Seminar in Big Rapids, Michigan, and we pick up Frank Ford dressing frets, and he's a sight to see. These three men are good friends of mine and great repairmen and builders, and I hope you learn as much from them as I have. Who says Gibson makes the only blues guitars? I think I said that, but I take it back. This lovely guitar made by T.J. Thompson changed my mind. He's our next guest, and he's going to show us how to use the old-style bar refrets. Come on up, TJ.
All right, thanks very much, Dan, for the intro. I'd like to start out by thanking Asia for distinguishing me with this opportunity to chat with you this afternoon. I'm going to be talking with you about my technique of bar fretting. There are two main applications that come to mind for using bar frets. One is repairing an old fingerboard, and the other is in the new building, a new guitar. I'm going to be talking today about repairing a neck that is bowed forward, that has too much forward bow in it, and how to take that bow out using those bar frets. This particular yard sale special was made by C.F. Martin Company in 1931. This neck has virtually no reinforcement in it. There's no adjustable rod, there's no metal bar, and so the neck tends to bow forward with all this string tension on it. What I have in this situation is a dip in the neck right through, frets 3 through 9. There's a dip of about 15/1000ths of an inch in the middle of this neck. What I'm going to be doing is pulling these frets through the center of the neck, replacing the frets in this area of the neck with wider frets. I have to point out, Dan wants me to clarify, this is not really a yard sale special. This is an OM45 made by Martin Company, and it's worth many thousands of dollars. Okay, I'm heating the frets out here with my soldering iron and pulling them with my head nippers. I like to get the frets good and hot so that it doesn't chip the fingerboard. You'll notice in this shot I've changed soldering irons. The last one was not heating the frets out well enough, and I had a few chips. These frets are now coming out beautifully. Okay, you see in this shot I've pulled frets 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And I'm going to give this a try. I'm going to stop at this point find some sandpaper around here and clean up this board. Okay, I have the frets pulled here. I've got the fingerboard sanded, cleaned up, and I'm about to set the router depth to open these slots up, clean them out. And there are two things to keep in mind with that. One is the size of this bit. In this case, I'm going to be cutting using a cutter that's the same size as the slot that's already here. I'm not going to enlarge it, and I don't want to make the slot any narrower. If it tends to be deeper, I don't want to make that slot any narrower. I want it to be just the same. So I'm going to use the bit that's the same size as this slot. And the other important detail is to set this depth. This particular wire I'm using is 160 thousandths. These frets are sticking up about 50 thousandths, so I'm going to want to make this cut at about 110. So I'm going to eyeball this, hold the fret up against this bit and look and see and measure at about 50 thousandths. That's the depth I want to cut these slots at. Okay, we've zoomed in this shot so you can see a little more clearly what I was describing. You see the amount of the fret sticking up over the top of the cutter is about 50 thousandths. Take my word for it. Okay, I have these fret slots cleaned up now. Fingerboard is sanded. The next step is the tricky part, which is I have to determine what is the proper gauge wire to put in this slot. When you're building a new guitar, you can play with all kinds of variables. You can play with the bit size, and you can play with the wire size. In this, the bit size obviously is going to affect the size of the slot that you end up with. In this case, I'm not going to play with the slot size at all. In other words, I'm not going to change the bit size. I'm going to just play with the wire gauge. So in this case, if I have 50,000 slots here, what I want to do is start with a wire that's more than 50 thousandths. I need to start with a wire that's, say, at least 55, so I can file it down and play around with the fret compression that I'm going to get in these slots that are now cleaned out. Okay, this is the piece of the wire that I just took out of this deck. You can see on my micrometer that it's reading about 52 thousandths. Okay, what you see in this shot are sections of Martin bar fret wire that are available. I bought this stuff from Martin Company. That's the only place I know of that you can get it. They sell two gauges. One is 51 thousandths, the other is 57 thousandths. Obviously, since the fret I pulled out is 52, I'm going to have to start with the 57 thousandths and dress it down to size. Most of you use this tool for bending fret wire. I'm going to use it in this scene to straighten this fret wire. You can see it has a curve in it. I'm going to use the fret bender to take the curve out of this bar fret stock. Next step is to cut the frets to the proper width, and I do that by filing this edge flush, holding it up against the edge of the fingerboard, and I eyeball the other side, put my thumbnail in place, and I cut the fret to length. Now I file the other end of the fret flush. I'm using this piece of rosewood here to protect this edge of the fret. I wouldn't want to do this on metal because it would damage the top of the fret. I'm using it to help me radius this fret. So I'm matching the radius of this fret to the fingerboard. I'm thinning this piece of fret wire down from 57 thousandths to 54 thousandths. This is a piece of fret wire that I took out. You can see it slides in more easily than I want it to into that slot. This is the piece that I'm now fitting, and it takes a little more pressure to force it down in there. The next step is to notch the ends of the fret wire, and I do that by grabbing the fret in the thickness of the binding and down the height of the fret. I'm going to use this steel block as my stop. So I file the end of the fret until the file hits the steel block. I pull the end nippers up against the block, and the block becomes my stop. You see I have the fret ends notched, and I'm ready to pound this fret into place. I set the fret into place, positioning it exactly between the edges of the binding. I don't want the fret ends to knock the binding off when I tap it into place. have to file the fret edges flush, the edge of the fingerboard. An important detail to keep in mind at this point is don't dress these fret edges over at a 45-degree angle. They should be nearly parallel with the edge of the fingerboard. Leave them sticking up straighter than you think will be comfortable. The trick is in dressing the edges properly, which we'll get to that next. You can see how I've secured the peg head with these clamps. Now for simplified step number 432, I'm going to clean up these fret ends, and I'm going to do this with the motion like this. So up to speed it looks like this. And a standard T fret, the motion is more like this. But on these, you're sort of coming around the side and then turning. This is a flush cut file on this one side. If you attended the last symposium, then you already know what this is. This is a piece of Venetian blind that I cut off. It's very thin aluminum that works beautifully for this next step, which is to file these fret edges. The frets right now are very sharp and dangerous to a player. So I set that into place. Then I'm going to use a piece of duct tape that I take the stickiness off the back of. I put it next to the fret. I'm going to be laying the file on this side of the Venetian blind, and I'm going to file this way. This duct tape is to protect the fingerboard should I slip off of this fret. You can expect this part of the job to take 45 minutes to an hour. This is 220 grit sandpaper. I finish up this step with 400 grit paper. Okay, and I'm using coarse steel wool in this shot. And finally I finish up with this fine cut quadruple aught steel wool. So the neck straightened out exactly the way I hoped it would, and I hope you found some of this information useful. And now I'm off to join Ken Fallon at the Fun and Games, Symposium 93.
It was great, TJ. Thanks a lot. Our next guest is Michael Stevens from Alpine, Texas. Mike was the senior design engineer at the Fender Custom Shop, which he co-founded around 1987 with John Page. He since has moved back down to Alpine, Texas to get out on the range. He's the long, tall Texan, and here he is, Mike Stevens. Well, thanks, Dan. That was a real generous introduction, and howdy to everybody out there in video land. What we're going to do here is start off showing you some of my quirky little tools and things that I use to do a refret, and well, let's get to it. All right, this is the first tool that I use. It's got a biflex truss rod. This is my fret leveling file. Basically, I got tired of looking for straight files, and I straightened them with this and the 7/16 open end. This is my fret hammer. I've used this for a lot of years. It's a tinner's hammer, and I just don't hit the fret very hard. This side I use for putting barbs in, and it's skinny on this side, fat on this side. If I want a barb, I move it around. These are called cant saw files. I don't use any fret shaping file except these. I do the edges with this. This is a right-hand file, and this is a left-hand file. This is an old one for big frets, which I don't use much anymore. I'll show you these, how they work later. Your basic little clean hand file that I do binding with. I remove frets with this. We'll talk about that in a minute. It's the same little file or pliers that everybody uses. This is how I shape my frets. It's got a notch in it. It's got a rounded face on the inside. We'll go through that. These I borrowed, and I'll show you how I grind mine. I left them at home, and but this will work just fine. And a feeler gauge. That's my fret arsenal, and a straight edge. That's about the extent of my tools. So let me show you how I grind a cutoff pliers.
All right, these crude little drawings are your basic end nippers, and what I do differently than the ones that I've borrowed here is this is the face of the thing looking down as I grind an area which actually ends up coming out like that straight off of my plier, leaving the old normal plier here, which I use for general cutting things off, and I get this real fine and flat so I can cut a fret off real clean. And the only trick that I've found, and when you grind it off, you have a notch, if you look from the side on your plier, is if you go all the way to the point and grind it off, it'll wear out real fast. You've got to leave a little tiny of the original tip meat here, just a tiny amount. All right, this is the nippers we're discussing, and here's how I cut. I lean slightly in and hold the nippers without wiggling them, a little pressure down, cut it off. One extra is on the nippers that I use are real long, 9-inch handles. You'll find on any kind of acoustics or Les Paul type guitar, when you're cutting these off, the handle's longer. It's much easier to cut these off than using the short handle. If you don't have the long nippers, when you cut off a fret, you have to hold your hand kind of upside down over the body, and it's uncomfortable to me, and that's why I like the long ones. I can get way back on the end. All right, let's tap in a few frets. This little anvil I use on almost all kinds of fret jobs. I like a lot of solidity, and I generally put it over a leg that goes clear to the floor, sits on the concrete. I like it solid. For a fender neck, I use this little block. It keeps it level just because this is the height of the steel. And I have a few other blocks that fit angle peg heads if they're not attached to the guitar, which is the way I produce my own. This piece of steel is actually small gauge rail, and I use it a lot of times like a neck block. It's covered with leather, and I like to hammer on this for all my fretwork. All right, these are my bending pliers. They've got a slot to allow the tang, and I've ground the inside round, as you can see, because the fret's going to be bent round. The way I've been bending for years is I use my thumb, and I tend to pull on the fret a little bit and try to put a little curve down on the very end, and it seems like when I pull it works better. And that's it. As you can see, I use a lot of wire. I put a little bitty overbend on the corner, and I start at the outside, and I don't like to hit very hard. Generally like to work from the outside to the inside, especially on a refret if there's any looseness to the outside of the cut. Sometimes you get wire that's a little bit rolled to one side. I tend to put all those frets in with the roll to the same side, and I might move my hammer slightly sideways. This is what I mean by hitting sideways. When my hammer comes down, it slightly moves to one side. It will roll a fret right on down to the fretboard if it's not really bad. If it's really bad, you shouldn't use the wire. As you can see, I use a lot of fret sticking out on a refret, but what I find is the mechanical advantage, when you need that last little corner down, you can just barely tap it and it'll go down. This is one of my favorite little fret tools, little cheapy vise. It's radiused on the top. It's got a relief in the jaws right here on the very end, about 1/4 inch. I'm showing you this because we're talking about fret ends. You're doing refrets, especially Rickenbackers that are over sanded. You got a little tiny curve right at the very end. You clamp your fret in here, and because there's relief in that vise, you can tap that last little bit, and you can play around with what angle you need. As you can see, it just curves it right at the very end. I've even had to grind them special for a special job just to fit the whole neck. All right, because of the way I sand frets, I'm real picky about taping, and I use different sizes of tape, and after a while you get to know that this 3/4 piece of tape fits that fret on every fender, and then you have to cut the rest of them. Lay that in there with my thumb, cut it a little bit, peel it right off. Of course, if you're doing a neck, got a lot of old crack finish, and you're taping these off, I really recommend that you don't run this tape very far down on the neck finish. You cut it off short, push it over. My favorite X-Acto for general work is this number 11 size blade, and as you can see, I've got the tip ground off. I just find that little bitty skinny tip for most work is too unstable, and especially on a fingerboard, it'll skate across and you'll have something to fix. All right, let's get it out of this jig and go down to leveling frets. This little padded C-clamp you see here has got a rubber pad on it. Go to the normal shoe store and get some crepe sole. drill a little hole, pop it on your clamp. All right, let's get down to the way I mill frets. First thing I'm going to do here is take the nut off. All right, just a couple of taps. Shake it loose. Usually just a couple of wiggles, out it comes. Because I don't have the tension jig, every time I check a neck on a fender, it's just laying in free air. If it were a Gibson and laying on a neck block, every time I put the rule on, the neck block goes exactly in the same spot. This is for demonstration purpose only. Normally I'd have a backlight against this. I set my rule generally in the middle, and I only use one rule. This is it. And it's not very heavy, so it doesn't deflect my neck. And I usually start looking in the center, and I move over what I figure is 1/8 of an inch. And I go usually to the outside edge, and then I'll back in because I can keep track of where I am. And I do that all the way when I'm checking the heights and looking for high spots. All right, the little leveling file I showed you earlier. If you build one, I recommend fine thread. Let's assume that I found a high spot on this neck now. I'm going to move it over so it sits on the solid part of the bench where I'm going to file. If I don't, when I press down with a file, I'm going to deflect the neck. I don't like to do that. If this was a Gibson guitar, I'd find this high fret. Well, instead of moving it over to the edge of the bench like on a Fender so I can file right here, I'm going to lay it on a neck block and move that neck block to the high spot I think, and very gently go after that high spot. I've slid the neck down for a little support. All right, using your imagination, this is a fret, and when you level them, if they're all uneven, you end up with uneven tops. I come with what's called a cant saw file, and I put a geometric where this little filled-in line is, and then I nick the corners off. It puts a flat on the fret. You've got the flat where you milled it. This is the shape of the file, and that's the file I do it with, called a cant saw file. The first thing I do after I've milled the frets with the file is come back with a block. Important that it's flat, fits your hand. 220 sandpaper. I go the same direction that I did with the file. Under normal circumstances, I'd move the neck around just exactly like I did with the file and support it. I want to get those cuts out. Once I'm happy with reducing those, I start the other direction. I move down the fingerboard overlapping. I'm trying to move my scratches in the direction that you bend a string. All right, now to the cant saw file I just showed you on the blackboard. I always start in the middle of the radius of the board, and I move toward the ends. Whoops, a little clumsy, huh? This is what I consider a right-hand file because I work from this side of the fret. I don't feel comfortable here, and I have the fret file ground off on the back, so I can't cut back here. And this is a file I consider my left-hand file. And you can see that it's ground closer to the bottom on this side than over here. I've relieved it. If I tip the file back a little to not take so much, I don't cut into the board. This is the right-hand file. It's comfortable for me on this side. This file is ground closer to the bottom here than it is over here, so I can back the file off if I want less cut and not cut my board or my tape. This is my left-hand file. I'm coming in from the opposite side, which is not as comfortable to me. This file likewise is cut closer here, relieved on the back, so when I move the file I don't cut my board and tape. Alright, the reason to have left and right is when you're working up on a body of an arch top or Les Paul, you're working to one side. It's comfortable with me. I work from the center over because I'll hit the body if I move the file. I have to do the other half of the fret. I'm doing it in quarters from the middle down. Then I spin the guitar around and redo that, and I've got the whole file or the whole fret shaped like I drew it on the board. Very geometric. About 1/3 of the fret left in the middle. Your bevels on both sides perfectly straight. That's why I start from the middle. If you're not careful and tip in, you'll cut those funny little points. And when you get them too close on the top and you start sanding, your fret will go down. All right, I've got a small file that's very uniform on the grind. I use it on the corners when I'm done. I come along, knock that little corner off. Sometimes you can roll it. I'm ambidextrous, so I can spin it around and go down the whole neck, just taking that little sharp piece off. That's the last corner off. Now we go to sandpaper. Because of the way I hold sandpaper, I tape off the ends, or I'll sand my fingernails off. All right, my sanding method is I cut my paper approximately this way, put it on my fingers, so I can sand either side with this center finger. I can get either side of the fret, and when you're learning, it's going to kill you right here. What I'm doing is only pushing on the, as close as I can to the board and to the side of the fret, never on the top. And what you can't see is I'm only working on the middle of the fret to the end. I like to look at that corner all the time. I always flip the guitar around. I do half the guitar, turn it around. I like to look at the fret end while I'm sanding it. If I sand from this angle, I can't see it. And now we finish it off with 600 paper. Somehow the top just seems to take care of itself. This is red rubbing compound number 7. It's what I use. Find whatever you want. I've still got it taped off. I'm going to polish this fret with the rubbing compound. As you can see, I'm working down on the end of the fret. I'm real anal about this. I'll turn it around and do it just like I did all the sanding, working from the middle out. As you can see here, I've worn through the tape while we're hurrying along here. On a maple neck, you don't want to do that at all, or you'll get into your finish. Working with a rosewood board, I've cleaned off the tape. It's been polished once, but I'm using 4/0 steel wool and cleaning it off, going along the edge, pick out a little bit of the rubbing compound, polishing this fret. Steel wool is not touching the fret. I'm cleaning up the fingerboard. And I end up a little piece of jewelry here with a satin finish on the rosewood board. There you've got a nice shiny fret, and you'll notice that I never went against the way you bend a string across a fret, always with the length of the fret. Well, that's it for my part of Symposium 93. I appreciate the invitation, and I'll be back 2 years from now. Right now I'm going out and spend money on the floor, buying wood and pearl, and look at the pretty guitars.
I'm using my fingers here to keep it off the top of the guitar, and I'm going to use my fingers here as a guide to hold this end up. So I'm going like this, and I'm just going to file. I'm going to file until it feels greasy, until it feels slippery. When it feels slippery, I know I'm cutting wood and finish and fret at the same time.
Same method they use, or they've got a machine that does?
I'm going to switch to a slightly smaller file. I absolutely don't use the same files every time, but I do like to use a couple different ones because the little chatter marks that the files make will be different sizes. And rather than making really deep chatter marks over and over with the same size file, I'll just switch to a finer one or a coarser one. At this point, the most control I have is with the longest leverage. So I'm going to hold my file and use it in a draw fashion across. So draw filing, it means that I won't accidentally let the file slip around a corner and scar down deeper than the fingerboard. Now you can feel that they're nice and smooth and straight across. Okay, at this point I've got my frets in, they're cut and trimmed flush, both sides. Their angle is nowhere near 45 degrees. I'm going to bring it over closer to 45 at the end. I just use the sandpaper on the same way, just hold it on there. If I were to jam it up and down, the first thing that's going to happen is I'm going to snag the corner of it. So I tend not to go forward with it, but I tend to go sideways and in circles. Still trying to support the neck as freely as possible, peg it off the surface. I have confidence that I won't make any scratches in the fingerboard any more serious than 600 grit. And that's very important to me because I don't want to have to recrown the frets that I just put in. At this point, what I'd like to do is round the ends off or smooth them up. And that's a process that I spent a little time thinking about. I have a fret end.
Yeah, he's doing it another way. Interesting
From end section. And I'm going to come by and I'm going to cut a little facet on each one. And looking down on the fret from the top. And it looks like that. I'm going to cut this facet right here. I'm producing a facet right there on each fret with a single vertical stroke with my with my fret file. Then I'm going to come back and I'm going to cut another little facet right here on each fret end to relieve this little part right here, so that the fret end, when finished, is going to have a rounded appearance, and at the very end it's going to be trimmed about like that when looked down on. My tool for that is a cant saw file, and if you don't know cant saw files, they're a three-cornered file that looks at first glance to be a 90-degree angle and 245s. It's not, in fact, that. Must be more like 100 degrees. And I've ground it to safe corners. I've got the front edge of it, the front corner is blunted just the tiniest little bit, so if I were to slip, I wouldn't dig a hole right through the china on it. And I'm going to hit each fret with a simple motion, and I'm going to drop downwards onto the wood. I'm going to slide over to bump the fret, and I'm going to push forward. So it's a drop, slide, and then push. And I'm going to do that to each of the frets in succession, down each fret, giving each one a single stroke. I've got the weight of my forearm behind it, and it's a nice simple stroke. Hit each one. Over the body, I don't need to be as neat, but I have to do several strokes to get a nice cut. And I'll just go over, flip it over, and do the same thing on the other side. I'm doing it fairly fast to show you that this is really what I do every day. Time. The second cut's more complex. This little corner cut, and I'm going to take my file with the straight edge up. I'm going to roll it around the corner in one quick swoop. Now all the frets have basically 4 cuts on each end. Didn't take me any time to make those cuts. And you can see that if you want to feel it, they don't even feel that bad yet. They feel pretty good. On my big sheet of 600 grit, which I have a kind of a spare sheet of here, I'll use it on my big plain body. If I have a part of a sheet that's maybe only partly eaten up by all of the stuff I put in there, I'll just take it and grind the edge of the fingerboard so lightly, just once over the frets and once over the edge of the fingerboard to give that edge of the fret, that little face, a 600 grit scratch instead of the file marks I had, and same along the edge of the fingerboard, just one time. If I don't have this piece left over, you can see I've made some nice little tracks, I'll use a sanding block and a really small piece of the leftover little strip, and I'll go same kind of way, like that. Really simple, top of the fret. I've cut that part off, and I just want to bring this curve up like so, which is extraordinarily easy to do because the top that I've rounded off is really rather small, ideally anyway. And so I can just take the fingerboard, the paper, and rub up and down the fingerboard like so. Keep switching to new spots on the paper as I move, so I get good cutting. I can really feel it biting into the frets as I go. This is just my finger. Nature's sanding block. I'm going to go over the ends of the frets as well, that I've got all those little facets on, and I'm going to clean them right off. Just rubbing, pressing good and hard on the sides of the frets there. At this point, I would like to introduce Mr. Steel Wool. The steel wool here comes in a really long roll. It's Belgian. It has no oil at all in it. It's extremely fine, and it has very long fibers. That are the good points. Those are the good points. The bad point of this stuff is that it's also really fragile, and it tends to get in the air, and you tend to breathe the little particles of steel. it's really nice and handy to use to just buff up the frets. It also buffs the fingerboard very nicely, gives nice parallel little very fine scratches. Edges are nice and smooth. I have two choices at this point, well, always more than two, I suppose. At this point, I could kind of leave the frets the way they are, and I could walk over to Mr. Buffer, and I could polish the edge of the fingerboard because I've got little scuff marks, you know, from my 600 grit. Or I can polish the frets too. The last item, product endorsement, is micro mesh again, and it makes a great polishing for the frets and the edge of the fingerboard. I've got 3200 grit at this point. I'm just buffing the sides of the fingerboard and the frets over the top. I'm going to be a little incomplete in this job. I'm going to graduate up from 3200 to 3600, which, believe it or not, they suggest that you do it that way. I'm going to graduate up to 400. 4,000, excuse me, on the sides of the neck. All just using it dry. Trying to work in a slight diagonal pattern, crossing edge of the neck again. Pop up to 8,000 grit, which is way excessive on the frets. But if you want a good cosmetic shine, this is the way to get it. Edge of the fingerboard again. 12,000 grit, which is their finest. They got a good shine right around the corner there, just lightning fast. Nice and shiny. Nice and shiny frets. A little oil on the fingerboard, and it's a done deal. Micro mesh is a wonderful material, and maybe after this little camera thing is over, I'll talk about it real briefly.
Let's wrap it up, you guys.
I'm done.
That's it. Let's hear it for Frank. All right.
Thanks, guys.